In a lot of cases, absent parents are bad for anime characters, but in Yuji's case, I think he's definitely better off without Kenjaku in his life. This dude is freaky, but it does make me wonder what would happen if Kenjaku did raise Yuji as his own child. Would he still turn out okay? Would he be as evil and apathetic as Kenjaku? Or would he turn into something even more monstrous? This is what we'll be exploring today. We are going to cover two potential futures for Yuji based on the philosophy of nature versus nurture. Is Yuji a good person because he naturally is, or is it because of how he was raised? This concept will essentially determine which side of the story Yuji ends up on. But before we get into that, we have to cover Yuji's early life because that probably won't change. One aspect that I think is obvious is Yuji will get introduced to Jujutsu way earlier than he did in the main series. Rather than starting his journey as a 15-year-old, being around Kenjaku means being constantly around Jujutsu from the second he is born. Maybe he won't be able to harness it right away, but we did see Child Megumi with his wolves, so Yuji should be able to start using cursed energy like 5 to 10 years earlier than he did in the main series. This means by the time he's 15 and the events of Jujutsu Kaisen take place, he will be a much stronger sorcerer starting out. I mean, we saw how much progress he made in just 1 year, so 5 to 10 extra years would make him a competent sorcerer as well, even without Sukuna inhabiting his body to expedite his growth. I do think Kenjaku would eventually feed a finger of Sukuna to Yuji, but it might not be until he's a teen or at least competent with Jujutsu to limit the possibility of Yuji dying. Kenjaku might also tell Yuji about why he can contain Sukuna and how it works, but more on that later. It's also worth noting that his physicality would likely still be the same, as he's the same dude he always was, just introduced to the concept of cursed energy much earlier. However, I'm not exactly sure this is a good thing. Cursed energy, and Jujutsu in general, is kind of a cursed life. Yuji being entered into that at a super young age could potentially change his personality in major ways. If he gets traumatized by cursed spirits or has to kill other sorcerers as a child, who knows how it could affect him. This brings us back to nature versus nurture and the two split timelines we need to explore. Let's start with nature. If Yuji is a naturally good person, then things get complicated. He would be raised with a twisted view of the world and it would take some serious work to get undone. His situation would not be dissimilar to Junpei's, where what he gets taught about cursed energy and Jujutsu sorcerers is littered with lies to give Kenjaku a child that can only trust him or her. Obviously, eventually this would be undone by someone at Jujutsu High, but this raises a question. Who would do it? See, in our current timeline, Yuji is the best person to do this. He's the most pure of heart and the most forgiving, and we see this most prominently with Junpei once again. But if it's Yuji that needs saving, who would do it? Megumi or Nobara? They're kind of cold to people they don't know. In fact, the whole school kind of is. In my opinion, there are 3 people that I think would be willing or able to save Yuji in this case. Principal Yaga, Gojo, and Yuta. Yaga is one of those characters that very much has the best interests of humanity in mind, and is also a kind-hearted person. He made and raised Panda, training him and also kind of treating the cursed corpse as a human, allowing it to seamlessly join Jujutsu society. The man could have been a special grade and he could have used his power to raise an army, but he chose not to, instead taking the secret behind Panda to his very last breath. While I do think he would be hesitant to accept Yuji at first, I think he would ultimately see the good in him if Yuji is good by nature. For Gojo, I think finding the 15-year-old cursed user on a mission would remind him a lot of himself and Geto, and his failure to save Geto from going insane and turning evil. He might even see Yuji as a chance for redemption for his friend who he now thinks is dead. This dynamic could be very interesting as well if Kenjaku still takes over Geto's body. Like, imagine if Gojo asks Yuji to describe his parents and he just describes someone who recently turned into Geto. I can totally see Gojo growing to hate Kenjaku from the very start, and it might even help prep Gojo for if Shibuya still happens, as he would probably be filled with rage rather than shock if he comes face to face with Kenjaku in the prison realm, meaning he might not freeze this time and might just kill Kenjaku right then and there. Regardless of if this would happen, I can definitely see Gojo taking Yuji under his wing, potentially by force even. I mean, it's Gojo, what is Yuji gonna do here? Even if he is stronger, he won't have all 20 of Sukuna's fingers, as a good number of them are in the possession of Jujutsu High, meaning he can't really stand up to Gojo on his own. And as for Yuta, I think he's just the next purest student at Jujutsu Tech Tokyo that could realistically beat this new stronger Yuji. They also kind of have a connection in their inner demons. Assuming Yuji Yuji has Sukuna in him and with Yuta overcoming Rika. They can also both relate to doing things they aren't exactly proud of in the past. Plus, I feel like Yuta can just become friends with anyone, kind of like Yuji, so I feel like they would bond fairly easily in this case, even with their differences. If we want to believe Yuji is a naturally good person, we also have to believe that to some extent he was opposed to Kenjaku even before joining Jujutsu Tech Tokyo. Kenjaku would definitely make Yuji do some pretty messed up stuff, which I think could cause some pretty severe internal conflict within Yuji, and it would act as a catalyst for him joining Jujutsu Tech Tokyo. Maybe he sees sorcerers using cursed energy for good for the first time, and it shows him that what Kenjaku has been teaching him maybe isn't all that true. Or maybe he's put in a situation where he uses cursed energy to save someone, and this is a completely new concept to him, and it just so happens to be observed by the sorcerer that was originally sent to deal with the situation, and he gets recruited from there. Or maybe he befriends a sorcerer by accident, and when they end up on opposite sides of the battlefield, he just can't bring himself to kill this person and then joins them instead, a la Junpei, except without getting turned into the cart titan. But I don't think Yuji changing sides would be a completely seamless task. There is one big deformed roadblock: Sukuna. If Sukuna rats Yuji out to Kenjaku, that alone would cause issues for him in ways I don't fully know. For all we know, Kenjaku might just kill Yuji if there are other of Sukuna's fingers around, as he could probably just make another vessel. So Yuji would basically be forced to choose one side once he is offered a choice. Once Yuji joins Jujutsu High though, I don't think the story changes all that much from a progression point of view. Sure, Yuji would be stronger, but I don't think that would affect the overall story all that much. Maybe the Kyoto Goodwill event or versus Mahito arc would go differently, but I don't think they would change all that much from where they are. And from Shibuya onward, I think the story pretty much stays the same, except that Yuji now has more complicated feelings about Kenjaku rather than not really knowing who he is. Yuji would definitely feel guilty about the things Kenjaku told him to do as a child and early teen as well, and I think this would lead to a lot more introspection than we currently get, and Yuji redeeming himself would be a fairly large theme throughout the series, as he wants to atone for the things Kenjaku made him do. But I think the outcome for Yuji will overall stay the same: a lot of pain and a lot of loss. Maybe even more so now that he's connected to Kenjaku. The nurture side is a lot more complicated, but before we get into it, please consider subscribing. I have this pipe dream of hitting 100,000 subscribers before Jujutsu Kaisen ends. It's super unlikely to happen, but it's not impossible. If everyone who's watching right now subscribes, we will get there, and I'm gonna make it worth your while, because if we hit 100k before Jujutsu Kaisen ends, I will do a hand reveal. The face reveal isn't coming for a long time, but the hand's a good start, right? So if you want to know what my hand looks like, or you just want to support the channel, please consider subscribing. It would really mean a lot to me. Basically, the idea behind Nurture is that Yuji is not naturally a good person. It is the result of how his grandfather raised him. And if this is the case and Yuji gets raised by Kenjaku, he's probably gonna turn into a villain. The idea of Yuji as a villain kind of fascinates me. He's one of those characters that should just never be one, but that is part of what makes it so intriguing and compelling. I don't think he'd be pure evil in the way some villains are, but he would probably take after Kenjaku in being apathetic to what happens to normal people and being much more willing to fulfill an evil and twisted curiosity. This, of course, changes the entire trajectory of the show. We could go over every single event that this would change and turn the whole series into a fanfiction, but that's a lot and also kind of cringe. So instead, I want to focus on a few pivotal moments that I think would be different if Yuji was on the other side of the battlefield. First of all, Yuji's whole relationship with the disaster curses and Mahito would be completely different. I don't know if Yuji would necessarily be like buddy-buddy with them, especially Mahito. I kind of feel like they would still be at odds. Like, they just will not get along in any timeline, even with evil Yuji. But I do think they would ultimately work together under the guise of both being allied to Kenjaku. I think the rest of the disaster curses would be somewhat okay with Yuji as long as his motivation is aligned with theirs. Being around and having access to such strong cursed spirits could also give Yuji strong opponents to spar and train against, allowing him to deepen his understanding of Jujutsu even further. He might even view cursed spirits more favorably overall, but it also kind of depends on how much Kenjaku influences him and how much Kenjaku lets Yuji in on his larger plan. One of the somewhat notable changes is that the versus Mahito arc would likely never happen, as Mahito's main motivation was to get Yuji to swap with Sukuna, which obviously wouldn't be needed now that Yuji and Sukuna are on the same side. This could have a pretty big butterfly effect, as it means Junpei might not die, and if he still runs into Mahito, he might even join the antagonists. But it could also have negative effects on the disaster curses as well, as it was through fighting Yuji and Nanami that Mahito developed his domain, which became a pivotal part of his kit later on. I don't think this means he would never develop a domain, just that it would take a bit longer, meaning his overall growth would be a bit hampered. But enough about that minor arc. Let's move on to the Shibuya incident, which we of course gotta cover. And I'm gonna be honest, this whole showdown would go differently if Yuji was evil, but the end result might be the same. Think about it, the villains already win the Shibuya incident. That's not going to change with Yuji on their side, you know? Plus, a lot of the events within the Shibuya incident would still need to happen for Kenjaku's plan. Mihito needs to die for the Culling Games to begin, so Yuji being the protagonist to kill him doesn't matter all that much since he still has to die. And all the other disaster curses are killed by other sorcerers, so Yuji not being there won't affect their fates either. I guess maybe Jogo would have lived longer depending on how Sukuna and Yuji interact, but Kenjaku did say he wanted Jogo's ability as well, so he'd probably die anyway. To be honest, I have a hard time seeing how this arc could go much worse than it already did for the protagonists, but I guess having a mini Sukuna also running around Shibuya wouldn't be exactly good. One aspect that could be interesting is the possibility of Yuji forming a rivalry with a student or two, and then becoming a reoccurring villain for them similar to what Mihito was for him. Reoccurring villains are really sick because they allow characters to grow independently and then face down with each other, raising the stakes and the meaning behind the fight simultaneously. Some of the best characters in fiction are reoccurring villains, so I think making Yuji one would really help him develop as a villain. I think the best option is probably Megumi, but I can't exactly put my finger on why. Maybe it's because both characters kind of feel like Naruto and Sasuke, even though I've never even watched Naruto, but I feel like the dynamic here could be really interesting, and this might actually be a method to make Megumi grow as a sorcerer rather than just being the unmotivated, depressed loser that he is. Sorry, I call it how I see it. Post-Shibuya would probably be somewhat similar, especially the Culling Games, as the only person Yuji fought was Higuruma. This does raise the question of who would fill Yuji's spot to fight Higuruma, as the rest of the students are kind of preoccupied. My best bet is Maki, since she didn't have a specific reason for going to Sakurajima, and she would actually be a decent counter to Higuruma's technique, since there's nothing Judge-Man can take from her, and she also might just be able to ignore the domain. This does raise the question of what Curse Noya does, but I think, low-key, if Maki still gets that second awakening, she might be able to just take Higuruma and Curse Noya at the same time, so it wouldn't really matter. I guess there is the possibility of Yuji playing the role of an antagonist to the students if he wants to, and this would definitely cause problems. Similar to Shibuya, this would tip the balance between the protagonists and antagonists in a way that could be detrimental to the heroes. It just depends which colony he joins and what Yuji actually does in the Culling Games. If he joins Tokyo 1, it could be the chance for a rematch with Megumi as a reoccurring villain. If he joins Tokyo 2, he could get in the way of Hikari and Kashimo, and depending on how many fingers he's eaten of Sukuna's, maybe beat both of them. If it's Sendai, then things get even crazier than they already were, and if it's Sakurajima, I kinda don't see Maki and Kashimo getting out of there, assuming Maki isn't in Tokyo 1. And if she is, then Kamo is definitely not getting out of there. Entering the Culling Games with the purpose of fighting the students isn't something that I think Kenjaku would make Yuji do, more so something that he would do of his own volition, as Kenjaku didn't really participate in the Culling Games in a way that prevented the students from moving. There's also a large possibility that Yuji would play a role in his own new colony, which could be a cool opportunity to learn more about him as an antagonist if Gege actually wants to put effort into character development for once. One aspect of the Culling Games that would have to be different is the creation of Meguna. I think Sukuna escaping Yuji's body would still be a fairly large goal of his and potentially Yuji's as well. Even as an antagonist, Yuji would still act as a cage for Sukuna, and having Sukuna get reincarnated would obviously help Kenjaku's goals a lot. The question is, where in the story would the Meguna moment take place? The big issue is that in this alternative universe, Yuji and Sukuna don't know Megumi's relationship to Sumiki, meaning they wouldn't know that her getting overwritten would be negative for the teen. They also wouldn't be able to guarantee that they are there when this happens because they are not a student at Jujutsu Tech Tokyo anymore. I think the best place for this to happen would be in Tokyo Colony number 1 if evil Yuji goes there, as Megumi was definitely not strong enough in that colony to beat 15-finger Sukuna if Yuji and Sukuna swap, meaning Megumi would be easily overpowered and Meguna would return. If they don't do it there, the same timing they did in the original story would probably work. It would just have to happen at random chance, which I think is not a likely route that they would take. And now we come to the Shinjuku Showdown, which is the arc that I think would be the most affected by Yuji being evil. Yeah, unless Gojo can beat Meguna before he develops the World Slash, I don't think the protagonists have a chance against Sukuna without Yuji. Not only was he the one to ultimately deal the final blow to Sukuna, but the amount of damage he did over the course of the battle was indispensable. They might even not try fighting Sukuna without him, and it only gets worse if Yuji is teamed up with Sukuna, similar to Uraume. There's also the possibility of Yuji being with Kenjaku rather than Sukuna, which could make things harder for Yuta, Takeba, and Todo. So no matter what, Yuji being evil here really puts the protagonists in a bad spot, and I think it's highly likely that the merger would happen in this fictional world. But if you think something different would happen, let me know in the comments down below. I would love to hear any and all feedback on this topic, as I think it's just interesting in general. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to to subscribe. Thank you so much for watching as always, and maybe check out this other one on what if Yuji reached his full potential.